Today's episode is a powerful one. Our guest, Mark Light, is someone who has stared down adversity more times than more of us can imagine. From surviving life-threatening illnesses like bacterial meningitis and severe pancreatic disease to enduring a multi-year battle with stage 4 cancer, Mark's story is one of relentless resilience. Just recently, Mark received the life-changing news that he is now cancer-free. In between these challenges, he cycled across the United States to raise money for a young girl battling the very disease that nearly took his life. He's also authored a book titled Rock Bottom to Resilient and is now stepping into a new chapter, helping others build resilience through speaking, coaching, and consulting. Let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
Amazing. Can we start from the beginning? Do you want to just give us a brief overview of your journey over the past 25 years?
Yeah, it was about 25 years ago or close to that I guess where you can say this all started really, even though the roots of it go much earlier in life. It was one night in, I believe it was 2002, laying there getting ready for bed, and some pain in my belly showed up that I didn't really think much of. And fast forward, I was an hour or so later in the emergency room and was diagnosed with pancreatitis, a disease I'd never heard of before, but it was intense pain. And that caused a 9-day hospital stay. And I just thought that was kind of one and done. Well, that was the beginning of a battle, if you will, a health battle that took me about the next 13 years, where it became quite severe at times. And at least 3 times that I can think of, it nearly took my life. You know, pancreatitis, until I had it, and if you ask anybody in the medical professional or profession or anybody that has been stricken by it or knows somebody who has, it's widely considered probably the most painful illness or painful thing that can happen to people. I had one doctor tell me that on the pain scale, it is more painful than severing a limb. And so it's an intensely painful disease, and it's more deadly than most forms of cancer. So that was an off again, on again 13-year journey that had a little bit of a setback with bacterial meningitis mixed in, and so that's where things really started, kind of from a health perspective anyway, and other perspectives in my life anyway. That's where things really started getting kind of wild and crazy, and from the health perspective. But that was far from the end of things, because fast forward then from there, I had probably about 7 or 8 years prior, seemingly put the pancreatitis and the bacterial meningitis and other issues health-wise behind me, and then was diagnosed in August of 22 with stage 4 cancer. So it's been a wild ride from a health perspective, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And what sort of symptoms were you getting that, I guess, triggered the journey of getting diagnosed with stage 4 cancer?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny because it shows me, as I look back on that, how powerful denial can be. And the reason I say that is the symptoms, the symptom that ended up taking me to the emergency room that morning was belly pain, which was, in that regard, is similar to pancreatitis. But I knew it wasn't the same kind of belly pain as pancreatitis. Anyway, the day that I went to the emergency room, I Googled colon cancer symptoms. That's telling all by itself. So I must have known something. That's the reason I say denial is a pretty powerful force. And an article came up with, I can't remember, it was 7, 8, or 9 bullet point symptoms, and I had all of them. But the one that was most intense was the belly pain that took me to the emergency room.
And it wasn't one of those cases where everyone Googles their symptoms and dramatizes it, and then, yeah.
Well, I didn't even Google I didn't even Google my symptoms. I Googled colon cancer, which did end up becoming only a couple hours later my diagnosis. So on
So,
some level, I
yeah.
kind of knew what was going on.
So you knew like what specific cancer it was subconsciously.
On some level, yeah, I did. I was not surprised when they walked in my room and told me that I had colon cancer. There was no surprise to me at that moment.
And so your initial thoughts were jumping to problem solving straight away.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny because you always hear people talk about what their experience is when they get their cancer diagnosis, and the whole like the breath got taken out of my lungs, and my life was suddenly turned upside down, and all of those experiences of shock and that type of thing. And I didn't experience any of that. And I think it's for two reasons. One is I was running a business at that point in time, and the business was losing money fast, and I was hemorrhaging money. So in many ways, well, my first reaction, quite honestly, and I've told this many times, is my first reaction was, yes, I get to shut down this roofing company. It was a roofing company.
Yeah.
And I didn't fail. I got sick. So it was almost a relief there that
Wow.
I could set my pride aside and shut down a business that I knew was losing money. And the
Yeah.
other thing, quite honestly, was, you know, it, as I've described it many times as well, it took it took the it took things back into an arena that I knew well. Health problems were not new to me, and life threatening health problems were not new to me. And so it was almost like, okay, major health problems psychologically, I can deal with this. I've got a history here of these types of things and overcoming them. And there wasn't, it's not like I didn't, that the diagnosis was still, I processed as fairly bleak, but it took it into an arena that I had a lot of experience with. So there was a level of comfort, oddly enough. Another way to articulate it is, and if you stare down the barrel of a gun long enough, the gun stops being scary and intimidating to you, even if it is about to go off.
Yeah.
So,
I've never heard that analogy before, but that's, yeah, a very good way to put it.
yeah.
Do you think your mindset was different getting this diagnosis compared to your prior diagnoses because you had been through, like you said, complex health conditions?
Well, I think that definitely helped. And I think
Yeah.
I think there's probably a life lesson to be learned in there. In fact, I've taken it as such. Previously, with the pancreatitis and with the bacterial meningitis diagnoses, there was no fear, because in both cases the pain was just so intense. There was no room for any fear. You just wanted the pain to go away. It was like in both of those diseases, I would have sold my soul just to make the pain go away. That's how intense that pain was. So I didn't even, just, for me anyway, when physical pain is that intense, I just didn't have any bandwidth for worry or shock or anything else like that. So by the time the cancer came along, yeah, the pain wasn't, I mean, it was quite intense, but nothing like the previous two illnesses. But in that case, like I said, that I think that all the previous health matters prepared me psychologically to where it wasn't an intimidating process for me.
Yeah. When they said it was stage 4, did they say what your odds of survival were?
No, nobody ever said odds of survival. What they did say, when I I was forced. I'm from Indianapolis, or that's where I've lived most of my life, and when at the time of my diagnosis, I was living in San Antonio, Texas. Well, the first thing I did, obviously, is I shut down my business and started making plans to relocate back up to the Indianapolis area, where I could be closer to family and much larger friends base and certainly family base, but also be in the hospital system that had treated me with the previous illnesses. Now that when I moved up there, that oncologist that I got assigned to, she immediately said, yeah, the people who present as you are, stage 4 metastatic, it had metastasized, it spread to my liver at that point. The average prognosis was 3.5 years. And I passed 3.5 years a couple of months ago, and did receive my, right about that point, that note that I was cancer free. And it's not the first time I've been told I was cancer free, but it's the first time I've actually felt healthy. And it's certainly is the first time that they did a DNA test and there's no evidence of disease, or wasn't any evidence of disease a couple months ago. So alive and well and kicking and now cancer free. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Yeah, so good.
I think the first time I'd been told that I was cancer free was about 8 or 9 months into my cancer journey. And I had to have another surgery because I had several rounds of chemotherapy at that point, and the tumors in both my liver and my colon had been shrinking. And so they said, hey, we can go in aggressively now and remove those surgically. And they were very quick to declare me cancer free. And they did declare me cancer free one other time. And I never felt as if I was, just kind of, I'll say that I was very quickly followed up after being declared cancer free, that the cancer was back. And then in both of those instances, they declared, or they acknowledged, I should say, that, yeah, the cancer was never gone. And the truth is, once cancer hits stage 4, it's with you. It's, even now that I'm cancer free and I'm developing, or I'm getting my strength and mental energy back, and I feel the healthiest I've felt since probably years before my cancer diagnosis. I also know that I'm living on borrowed time. It's and that could be a very long time before the cancer does come back, but it could be back already and I don't know it. So, but the fact that I'm living on borrowed time, that doesn't make me any different than anybody else in the world. We're all living on borrowed time. It's just mine is right in front of my face.
Yeah, I guess tomorrow is never promised for anyone, like for anything. But
Yeah.
I guess we get a bit lax sometimes because we feel like we are going to live to 80.
Well, I think I've always felt like ever since, I've been off again, on again, facing my mortality for many years now with all of the illness. And I've developed this thing that I think that most of us, while we intellectually realize we're not going to be here forever, most of us all sort of have this low key going through life believing that death is something that happens to other people. Most of us never really, on an emotional level, process the fact that, yeah, and I'd been saying it to your point, Karen, that early on, right after diagnosis, I was kind of unaffected by things, at least emotionally, and people would almost marvel at that. And I said, look, I've still got the same promise and the same guarantee to tomorrow as you or the healthiest person in the world, which is no guarantee. But I do think that we tend to live in denial about our mortality as humans anyway. And that's maybe not such a bad thing.
Yeah, for sure. How would you say your mind shift is different knowing that you do have maybe a reduced mortality, or like you said, like yours is more in front of you?
I've reached the point where I enjoy having my mortality sort of hanging in front of me because it does center me. I don't get nearly as caught up in day-to-day problems as certainly as I used to. I tend to focus on the good in my life, and there's a hell of a lot of good to be focused on. I tend to put my energy into things that are people and things that are more important to me. I just don't get caught up in near as much of the day-to-day nonsense. Now, traffic still drives me quite insane. So I still haven't figured out a way to deal with 5 o'clock traffic. But, give me a
Yeah.
life-threatening illness or a major problem and not such a
Yeah.
big problem.
So at what point did you start to see yourself as someone resilient?
I don't know that I did really until the cancer diagnosis came in, and that caused a lot of self-reflection. And I started not only realizing, but I was getting a lot of outside validation about what a positive attitude I had in the face of circumstances that most people would say, "Gosh, I don't know what I would do if I was facing
Mm,
stage 4 cancer down." And objectively and whatnot, and as far as just in my own mind, I realized, yeah, I'm not as it was like I didn't understand the people who, as we talked about earlier, that were completely blown away by a cancer diagnosis. So I started doing a certain amount of self-reflection and saying, where did my mindset shift? Because I was growing up, probably for the first 40 years of my life, I was not somebody that I would have considered having anywhere close to a positive or resilient mindset. And so as I looked back, the transformation really started for me 20 years ago when I was first getting into some of the health problems and getting knocked down pretty hard. It's
yeah.
just it's been a process, but it was never intentional in my case.
Yeah. Did you see as well that you didn't really have another option? Like you either persevere and push through or, curl up into a hole and essentially die, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to put it because you do go into, and I felt this very palpably after the cancer diagnosis, even though I wasn't intimidated by it. You do kind of go into what I'll describe as a survival mode. And, uh, and that's a hard thing to describe other than the fact that I think that the two things, the best ways I can describe it is that for me anyway, I tend to become a lot more assertive. Um, and I tend to reach out to my network, my friends, my family, and that type of thing. Hopefully not, it didn't come off this way, not in a needy way, but I started reestablishing, ties. And
Mm,
so, yeah, but I think different people process that survival mode different ways. That just happened to be my way. How did I go from, very literally feeling like, and medically feeling like I was circling the drain to cancer free, where I actually do feel cancer free for the first time in years.
yeah. Which is funny you say that because I was going to ask as well. I wonder how much your mentality of the whole situation affects your recovery. And like you said, you still want your quality of life and goals. And I wonder if still having a sense of purpose outside the hospital also helps.
Well, if you go by what my oncologist said in that very conversation, it was huge. She said, "Hey, your mindset through all of this has been probably at least as big of a deal," or however she worded that, "as anything we've done for you." So I do
Mm,
believe more so than ever that a positive mindset in the face of these life-threatening illnesses is enormous. The question
yeah.
then becomes, how do you develop that positive mindset? Because it's a little bit of a process.
Yeah, you took the question right out of my mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
So you want
people
me to?
listening, do you have
Yeah.
any strategies of, yeah, because you said you weren't naturally that way, so I guess it was a
Yeah.
journey, but could you think of key points?
Yeah. I do. In fact, that was the self reflection that I put in my book, and there's a couple different ways I can articulate that. Um, I refer to it now a couple of different ways, and I think of acronym TRASH, um, which, without, it's not an all day podcast segment, so we can't go into deep dive on all of this. TRASH stands for tactical vulnerability, radical responsibility, attitude aerobics, supportive village, and healing humor. Some of those to a degree are sort of self-describing, but the other way that I articulate is the three P's: push, process, and prove. And what I'll say to somebody who, for the purpose of somebody who is already deep in the adversity, say an adversity or a situation that's similar to mine in some form or fashion, is um, think attitude aerobics, and that gets into a whole conversation what that actually means. But regardless of how dark of a place you may find yourself in, I still believe that there are things you can look at that you can be grateful for. And expressing that gratitude to the people in particular who you are grateful for is enormously powerful. And then tapping into your village by just being authentically vulnerable. And there's a fine line when you're vulnerable, because let me articulate it this way. I had sort of long since unknowingly established a little bit of a brand for myself through the bike ride that I had done 10 years ago for the fundraiser for the little girl. And that sort of cast me in a light as a hero. That was never my intent, but that did end up happening. So I have to acknowledge that I had that going in. But when I first got diagnosed, I told my mom and my two grown daughters, I said, look, don't share any of this with anybody. Let's keep this a secret, because I said, what I don't want is any of my health situation to get out on social media. And then a few days later, I was still in the hospital. My mom called me. She was getting remarried. My dad had passed away several years prior, and she was getting remarried in a couple of weeks. And she said, well, you're not going to make it up for my wedding. I said, yeah, there's no way. I'm not getting out of the hospital and going to be able to gather myself to be up there. She said, all right, so what should I tell people about why you're not here? And I thought, okay, that's kind of a difficult one here. Let me think this through. Anyway, I decided that what I was going to do, was type out one Facebook post so that I just threw out there, and it was going to be a detailed post about my circumstances, just so that no rumors would start, and that the narrative was accurate about where I was and what I was dealing with. And I thought that'd be a one and done. Well, I put that out there, and the outpouring was of support and love and everything was astounding. And that's where I realized this was a story that needed to be shared. But anyway, back on point, having that village around me and whatnot, that was a huge part of it. I mean, life is going to throw difficulty at you. We just don't know when or what that's going to look like. So a lot of what I talk about are getting very intentional about expanding your comfort zone. One of the reasons why I have emotionally weathered the storm that I have is because, like we talked about, cancer was far from the very first major health issue. So I tell people a lot of times, get out of your comfort zone, go choose hard. And by that, I mean, live as much as you can outside your comfort zone, grow, do new things, because in my case, hard chose me. But when you do those things, those stretch things, it prepares you for difficulty in ways that you don't know how it's going to prepare you. I mean, if you're used to being uncomfortable, then when uncomfortable situations arrive that you've never seen before, it's not the first time you've lived in that uncomfortable. And I think that's a really big part of this.
For sure. It's like a muscle when you work it out and it gets easier. Like you had somewhat with the previous health conditions, had been in that boat before.
Exactly how I've articulated it, is resilience is like a muscle.
Yeah.
It's a life skill, meaning it can be developed out of thin air. But if it's not developed and not nurtured, it's not going to be there, or certainly not much use to you when you need it.
Yeah. I think with affirmations as well, even if you are in like a dark spot and you don't believe them, I think vocalizing it and saying it out loud to the world, or like you said, telling other people what you're grateful for, makes you start to believe it as well.
So, I think this is just my belief here based on my experiences, but it's not just my belief. I think there's some science and psychology to back this up. Affirmations are fantastic. This is the reason why I call my three P's push, process, and prove. That's the third of my three P's. If there needs to be some actual behavior behind the affirmation to back it up, because your mind is a pretty powerful device, and it'll figure you out. And if the affirmations, regardless of what they are, if they're simply affirmations, words, then eventually your mind is going to go, yeah, you're not actually that positive, or
Mm.
if your affirmation, for example, is I can deal with, say, cancer, and cancer does not affect me, or whatever that sounds like. But as soon as you're done saying that, you fall back into maybe a self-pity or a victimhood mindset. And these are things that rob you of a lot of energy, emotional energy, mental
Yeah.
energy, and that type of thing. So those are, I think, danger zones. But if you don't behave in a way that is congruent with the affirmation will lose its power pretty quickly. And that's why I say prove is, over time, behave your way into a person that you identify. You are the person that your affirmation says you are.
So can we talk about the girl that you cycled across the country for and to raise
Sure, yeah.
money?
One of my favorite topics ever.
Amazing.
Well, first of all, I'll talk about the bike riding part of it, and then how the little girl kind of came into it.
Yeah.
I had always, going back to childhood, been kind of a bike guy. I love to spend days and stuff. Just me and bikes seemed to biking was my thing, various kinds. And I got away from that into adulthood. Well, then after a particularly rough year with the pancreas disease, I was in my early 40s, and I was always, even as an adult, even though I wasn't into biking or cycling or anything, I was always kind of a fit, active person. I was a little bit of a gym rat. Well, I wasn't, to a point after about a year dealing with a lot of health setbacks, wasn't to a point where I was ready to put my gym rat hat back on. But I did buy a bike and started getting out and riding around, and as a way to get my strength back. And but I was not what I would refer to as an adventurous person. I was never a Boy Scout. I had never done hiking or anything like that. Well, a fellow pancreas patient, we shared the same surgeon, who was an avid outdoorsman, talked me into going out and hiking the Grand Canyon with him. And that was the very first hike I had ever been on in my life. And it changed.
Wow.
It was I'll just say, a very intense 3-day trek that I'd prepared physically and mentally for over a fairly long period of time. And I walked out of that Grand Canyon that day and I felt invincible. And I thought, there's nothing in the world I can't do. And on the plane ride back to Indiana, the thought popped over my head. I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to ride my bike all the way across the U.S. And I thought I invented the idea. And as soon as I land and I get home, I start Googling it. And I thought, oh, God, maybe I'm the only person in the world that hasn't already done it. And so I certainly
Yeah.
didn't invent the idea, but I became sort of obsessed with the idea of riding a bicycle across the U.S. coast to coast, and started accumulating the equipment and the experience and that type of thing. And then in 2016, and by the way, I had set up a foundation along with my surgeon who had treated me with the pancreas disease. And so we already had a foundation set up, and we were sort of searching for an identity or what this foundation was actually going to do. But the foundation was set up to provide support. And we weren't talking about monetary support necessarily, but support for families, patients and the families stricken by pancreatitis. And it just happened that I was acquainted with a gentleman who lived fairly close to me, and he had a little girl who was only 3 years old at the time, and she had been dealing with a childhood form of what had nearly killed me, and she needed a life-saving surgery, and they were going to remove her pancreas completely, which was a fairly radical surgery, and they were needing funds for a lot of the ancillary stuff. And I simply decided to coattail on that because I intensely wanted to ride a bike across the country. And the reason I kind of adopted that as my pet project, I didn't want the cross country bike ride, which was going to take me a couple of months, to be so self-indulgent. I thought, well, if I'm doing this for a cause like this, then it's not a self-indulgence. It's a little bit, it feels a little bit more of a noble experience. So, I reached out to them, and of course they agreed to let me do this fundraiser because they were just starting to reach out and ask their community for help through GoFundMe's and that type of thing. And so that became the catalyst by which I started planning and promoting a cross country ride. And I did that in the fall of 2016. And it was something, like I said, I was going to do anyway, but because I was doing it for the cause and for the little girl, it turned into one of the most epic magic carpet rides I could have ever undertaken. It was amazing, the people that I ran into and the stories that came from that time.
Yeah. Do you have any like crazy stories if you had to pick one?
I think the most amazing thing that happened, it was barely a week into the ride, and I was in Tempe, Arizona, just on the outskirts of Phoenix, and I stopped at a small Chinese restaurant for lunch, and young lady behind the counter who took my order barely spoke English, and so the act of ordering lunch was a little bit cumbersome. Well, I was wearing my cycling clothes and whatnot, and it was a nice day, so I got my food and I went out and sat on a little picnic table next to my bike, which was parked outside. And as soon as I sat down, I looked up and she had followed me. The young lady who took my order had followed me out there. And in her broken English, well, there was a little sign on the back of my bike that had a picture of me and the little girl I was doing the ride for. I almost didn't put that sign on there, but that sign seemed to attract a lot of people inquiring, asking what I was doing. So it
Mm.
turned into some of the most beautiful interactions ever. And I almost didn't take that along with me. Well, she came out and she asked me, she said, "Is that your daughter?" And I said, "No, it's a little girl." And I tried to explain to her what I was doing. And she said, "Well, how do I donate?" And
Wow.
my mind immediately goes to she's working in a fast food restaurant and she probably doesn't make much money. And yes, I was doing this as a fundraiser, but I tried to downplay that part for the purpose of this conversation. I said, "Oh, thank you." But I said, I don't need your money, but I had these little business card things that did take people to our social media page and to the donate page. And I said, if you just don't mind sharing the word and spread the word of what we're trying to do here. I said, but I don't expect any, you to donate any money. But I did ask her, as I asked everybody that I interacted with, I said, do you mind if I get a selfie with you? And is it okay to post it on social media? And if you're on social media, if you're on Facebook, can I friend you and or tag you in the photo and just talk about this interaction? She agreed, but then immediately started crying. And
Oh.
and she said that, again, it was a very broken English type of a thing. And she said, I am on the waiting list for a kidney transplant. And she said, I have been on the waiting list for several months now, but they tell me it's going to be at least 3 to 5 more years before I get my kidney transplant. And there's no guarantee that I'll survive long enough to receive the kidney. And she said that, and again, in her very kind of broken English way, she said, that's why it's important I donate, because once you've been on that boat, you know what it feels like to be on that boat. And
Wow.
so I told that entire story and posted the picture. She was a very attractive young lady, and I posted it, but she said that she didn't have a social media account. And so that post brought out an incredible outpouring of emotion from people who are following along with my journey. Well, I moved on and kind of forgot about it. I didn't have any way to keep in touch with her. Fast forward about 7 weeks later, I was nearing the end of my 2-month-long journey, and I one evening just opened up my phone to look at some emails, and I had an email from her. And I don't even know how she got my email address, because I did respond to the email, but it said, I just wanted to let you know. She first of all told me who she was. And she said, I just wanted to let you know, thank you to you and thank you to some good heart person out there. I did receive a kidney 4 weeks ago and I'm doing well. And I said, oh my God. And I responded back to her to ask her, tell me more of this story. Because when we spoke, she said they were telling her 3 to 5 years and there was no guarantee that she would survive that long. And I never received a response back to my email. Like I said, I don't even know how she got my email address, but it leads me to believe that, kidney transplants are different than a lot of organ transplants, in so much as the patient can still be alive and donate a kidney.
Yeah.
And so what I have always believed, and until proven otherwise, this will be the thing I cling to, is I believe that somebody following my journey stepped up when they heard her story, because it was a very emotional one. Brought out a lot of emotion in the people who are following me. And that, I could sit here, Karen, and tell you stories all day long, but that's the one that really stands out as the most wow, epic story of that entire journey.
Yeah, that's so special. It just goes to show, like, in humanity, the connection people feel emotionally when they don't even know someone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's massive.
Because, to that point, it blows me away to this day. I was hundreds or thousands of miles away from home, from where this little girl lived. And it was incredible to me, the outpouring of love and support and donations and friendship that came through me to a little girl that they would never meet, they didn't know. And it showed me how, we hear so much negativity about how evil the world is. And it surprises me sometimes how this annoys people when I say this. I say, no, my experience, people are very, very good. Give them a chance to be, and people are just incredibly good.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people need to hear that a lot these days.
Especially these days, right?
Yeah. Yeah. How much money did you end up raising?
We don't know exactly how much, because some of the fundraising bypassed the foundation and went straight to the family. And that was for some legal purposes and that type of thing. But so we don't have an exact accounting on all of that type of thing, and never have. But I think somewhere in the area of about $60,000 was raised.
Wow. And did she get her surgery?
She did get her surgery. Yes, she did. She did receive her surgery. The bike journey happened in the fall of 2016, and in January, late January of 2017, she had her surgery. She was really not doing well at that time, but fast forward to now, to today, and she's, I guess, close to 13, or she would be 13 years old. Sorry, the math sometimes on birth dates and stuff. But
Yeah.
I have now, since I moved home after receiving my cancer diagnosis, she and I have gone on a couple of bike rides together, and so she's just a beautiful, thriving young woman now.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's really nice. Can you tell us a bit about your work now with speaking, coaching, consulting?
I have, going back to right after my cross country bike ride. Well, during my cross country bike ride, I had a number of people who told me, you should write a book about this. And, it felt like 100 people. It was probably about four or five. But I said, I don't know anything about writing a book. And besides that, the book that I would write probably wouldn't look like anything what you would imagine, because I would write about the fact that, a lot of what led to that bike ride was me, was a lot of things going wrong in my life. And
Mm.
most people um, assumed that the reason that bike ride happened is because everything was just perfect in my life, and that way I could take the time off and go out there and do that. Well, the other thing is that after moving to San Antonio a few months after the bike ride, I started looking into being a public speaker, and I had made a lot of friends in that area with folks who were either current or former professional speakers, and all of them validated me, saying, "Hey, you've got an incredible story, and you've got the ability to tell it well." And they were encouraging me to go down that, to follow that endeavor. Well, life happened, and the need to earn a living, and that just sort of got backburnered because I had no idea how to go about. Like I said, it just got sort of backburnered. But then when I was laying in my hospital bed right after my diagnosis and the emergency surgery, knowing that I just shut down my business,
Mm.
I mean, on one hand, I'm sitting here thinking, well, I don't know if I'm going to survive this, or if I do, I don't know for how long. But I thought, what am I going to do with myself if I do survive? And then I thought, well, wait a minute, this public speaking thing. I thought all I have to do is survive, because now the story just got really good if I can survive this, especially. So anyhow, now that I have returned to health, I am working very, very hard, and I do public speaking about resilience, mental toughness, confidence, all of which that I consider I use them interchangeably. I speak on financial resilience,
Hmm.
because most of my adult life, my career I was a financial advisor, and I advised people on how to protect themselves from disasters like the one that I experienced, and
Yeah,
I didn't follow any of my own advice. So I was a
that's
hypocrite.
always the
That
case.
it's so common in that realm, and maybe other realms, and
Yeah, yeah,
so I speak on, hey, don't do what I did. It
yeah.
wasn't a lack of knowledge that kept me from doing things, but it's just talking about ways that even as a financial advisor, I didn't realize existed for how to protect myself, and make myself more resilient financially. So I speak on that, and then
Mm.
a lot of even my book um, is written really largely with the sales profession in mind. I've considered myself to be a professional salesperson for about the last 35 years. And from a professional point of view, that subset of the population, say professional salespeople, are probably the more in need of resilience than any other population out there. That life has a way
100%.
of knocking them down. So a lot of what I do
Yeah,
is geared with the sales profession in mind. But
yeah.
when you get right down to it, Resilience, like we talked about a few minutes ago, it's a learned skill, but it's a critical life skill that people can develop. My website is Mark Light Group, my name, marklightgroup.com, and you can go and there are some testimonials there, people that have seen me speak.
That's really cool. I can't wait to see that develop. I'm definitely sure it will.
Thank you.
Now,
If it doesn't, it won't be for the lack of effort and passion.
well, if you never give up, technically you never fail. So just don't give up.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I like the way you
Now,
said that.
yeah. It's not original. I took it from somewhere else. I can't remember where I saw it, but I really liked it too. You sent me some questions that am curious about. So I picked a few. I thought we could maybe do them as like quick fire questions, unless
Sure.
there's some that you like need to elaborate on. The first one is, what is your mantra for how to beat cancer?
Yeah. This was a discovery that I made pretty early on, and I say that you don't beat cancer by going into remission or becoming cured of cancer, because you really don't have any control over that. You beat cancer by how you live every day with the disease. And that goes back to what we were talking about before, gratitude. Even on you, I'm a very active person. And look, there were days, particularly when the chemo was going on, I didn't have the strength to get out of bed. And you're going to have days like that, but choose to get up and move physically when you can. Reach out, establish social ties. Don't ever subscribe to the victimhood, and don't get into the self-pity and all of that type of thing. Cancer in many ways is like a bully, and it's like the schoolyard bully. But if you can smile at the bully and walk toward it and put your arm around it and make friends with the bully, it'll
Yeah.
freak it out, And so realize it became very apparent to me early on that I don't know whether I'm going to be able to survive this or not, but I
Mm.
can live an incredibly cool life even in the face of this disease. And I think that's how you beat cancer.
Just goes to show how much work you've done and resilience you've built. The next question, I'm intrigued. What is your dirty little secret about your cross-country bicycle ride?
That cuts into one of my coaching things. So I've had these talks where I do say, hey, I rode a bicycle all by myself across the entire United States. Now, my dirty little secret about that is I'm not capable of riding a bicycle across the entire United States. What I was capable of doing was waking up every morning at, say, 6 or 6:30 in the morning. I would have breakfast, and at breakfast, I would figure out where I was going to have lunch, and I would ride to where I was going to have lunch. And then at lunch, I would figure out where I was going to sleep that night and where I was going to have dinner, and I would ride there. And then I
Yeah.
just repeated that process 60 times in a row, and I made
Mm.
it all the way across the country. So the point that I'm making is I set the goal to ride my bike all the way across the US, but it was the process that got me there. If I had thought, I think one of the things that a lot of us get caught up on is we become very goal oriented. And I even wrote about this in my book, that goals by themselves can be worse than nothing, because and I'm going to take that endeavor, because a lot of people couldn't get their mind around the fact. A lot of people thought that what I was trying to do, or what I was setting out to do, was impossible. Well, it would have been impossible. In fact, I would have quit probably the first or second day if I was focusing on the goal itself.
Mm.
Because I would have thought it's too overwhelming. I'm making progress so slowly, it feels like I'm not making progress.
Yeah. It's like you have your head down and you focus on the small day-to-day achievable tasks until you get to the point where you look up and you're at the end.
Yeah, set goals, set big goals, but then you have to have a process, and then forget about the goal only to the
Yeah.
extent, only pay attention to the goal to the extent that you make sure your process is getting you closer to the goal, But then
Yeah.
that should not be the focus. The process should be the focus. In fact,
Yeah.
there's a book out there, one of the great books I think ever written, and it can change a lot of lives. And it's called Atomic Habits. And the author is James Clear. And he has
I've
one of
seen
the
it.
greatest.
Seen the book.
You're familiar with the book. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
He has one of the greatest quotes I've ever read. And I use it quite a bit. And he says in that book, he said, your results will never rise to the level of your goals. They will fall to the level of your processes. And that is one of the greatest truisms about accomplishment that I've personally ever read.
Yeah. And all the learning is in the process.
Very much so. That is so well said, Karen. Yes.
Okay. And who was the Russian man you met in the middle of nowhere in the Texas desert?
That was one of my other favorite cross-country bike ride stories. Was on my very last day of riding through the Chihuahuan Desert of West Texas, which had taken me about a week to traverse. And this particular day, it was a Friday, and there was very little food and water available. So I had to carry whatever I was eating and drinking on board. There was virtually no cell service, so I couldn't even reach out for help if I wanted to. It felt a lot like I was riding a bike across the moon. And, I had just spent the night in a very tiny little town, right literally on the border of U.S. and Mexico, where I didn't see a human for 17 hours as I slept in a tent. And it was a grueling week. And that morning, that Friday morning, I got up and I was riding kind of into civilization, but I had a long ride ahead of me. It was incredibly windy. And it turned out that was the single hardest day of this entire 2-month journey. And I was riding along about mid-morning, and up on the horizon, I could see what looked like a man running down this deserted highway pushing a grocery cart. My first thought was, oh, they said you'd start to lose your mind after a while. And I
This
was
is
starting
it.
this is what I said was going to happen. And then as I got closer, I realized, no, I'm not seeing things. And it was a man running, but he wasn't pushing a grocery cart. He was pushing a baby stroller, and he was running toward me. Now you got to remember, this is about halfway through a cross-country bike ride that, in my case, it was playing out on social media as a fundraiser. And I was having, especially in the Indianapolis area, a lot of media appearances. And so I was sort of beginning to read my own press clippings and thinking I was the baddest dude in the world by this point. And as it turned out, this gentleman who was pushing a baby stroller toward me, we stopped, and he was from Russia. So I'm a few hundred miles from home. He's several thousand miles from home. I'm riding my bicycle from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, for a little girl to raise money. He is running from New York City to Los Angeles, the opposite direction I am. And this is where our paths cross. He is doing his thing as a fundraiser for missing children. He'd already run across Russia and then came over to the U.S. to do this run here. And his baby stroller didn't have a baby in it. It was just his way of carrying all of his gear, his camping gear. And we sat there and we had about a 20-minute conversation, and I had him record a little video, and he and I remained very much in touch for a number of years, but have since lost touch. But the most amazing thing about that encounter was, in a 20-minute conversation, he asked me no less than 3 different times if there was anything he could do to help me. And I thought, are you kidding me? You're asking me if there's anything you can do to help me. And I'm on a bicycle, you're running, you're going much further than I am. I mean, just one of the most incredible human interest. And we remained in touch. I didn't have the heart to tell him, because I don't think I was just getting finished with the Chihuahuan Desert. This was going to be my last day. He was just going into it. So he was asking me questions about what he was going to be experiencing
Yeah.
for the next several hundred miles. And I didn't have the heart to tell him, dude, your life is about to get really, really rough. I hope you have a lot of food and water on board because that stuff
Yeah.
gets really scarce for about the next 300 or 400 miles. And he made it through though, okay, because I did find out, we were in touch through social media that he did make it to his final destination of Los Angeles and
Yeah.
whatnot, but we've since lost touch. But I was always blown away at, wow, I thought it was one thing to do what I was doing, but to do what he
Yeah.
was doing was a step and a half above. And he's asking me multiple times if there's anything he can do to help me.
Yeah.
Just incredible.
People want to help, and people feel good when they help people.
Yes, I agree. That's my experience. I've got a lifetime of experience to back exactly what you're saying as being true. Yes.
Yeah. Also, the timing of you two crossing paths on like doing the same thing but opposite directions is just crazy.
Yeah. I thought that was pretty wild as well.
The last question I have is, what is the controversial, can't say that word, sorry, controversial toxic trait that most people embrace but keeps them stuck in life?
Victimhood. I have long believed that victimhood status has elevated, at least here in the US. It's probably the most revered and sought after status that we have, and politicians run on convincing everybody in the population that they're a victim of somebody or something. And victimhood is a very comfortable place for people to live. And by the way, when I'm talking about victimhood, I'm not talking about being victimized. I could make the case in my case, I was victimized by cancer, but I am not a victim of cancer. I refuse to be a victim of cancer.
Yeah.
But when we choose to, and victimhood is insidious. It comes in so many forms we don't realize. And but when you choose to live in victimhood, on the surface, the reason I compare it to a toxic drug is because it's very comfortable. Because if we can adopt a victimhood status, well, nothing is our fault.
Yeah.
We're right about whatever we claim. The problem doesn't exist in us; it exists out there. So therefore, we're under no obligation to change anything. It's
Yeah.
everybody else or everything else that has to change. And it feels good to feel like nothing is our fault. But the reality is, in the big picture, that's toxic. That will certainly keep you from growing beyond adversity. You'll be stuck
Hmm.
there, and you'll need more and more of the drug to to get the same effect. So
Yeah.
it's similar in so many ways. Where the uncomfortable thing is to break out of that victimhood and empower yourself. And there's an actual process to go through that. But what's interesting about this is I find it interesting that if you go around and if you're talking to somebody or a group of people who are living in a victimhood mindset or have adopted a victimhood status, you would think intuitively or logically that telling them that no, you're not a victim, you actually have the power, that would be a welcome thing for them to hear. And people, they
It's
get
not.
pissed off at you. They don't
They
you
do.
dare take away my victimhood.
Yeah.
And so politically, victimhood has been politically weaponized in so many areas across all political spectrums. And again, if you go to somebody, the initial thing is anger and disdain for trying to rob somebody of their victim. And again, it's like going to somebody addicted to drugs and taking away their stash, and
Yeah.
that's never going to be a welcome thing in the moment. But if you can get somebody to realize how toxic that is and get them out of that victimhood mindset and that whole thing after the fact, and again, it's just like an alcoholic or a drug addict. They're thanking you for rescuing them from that mindset, but it's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah. Because you have to look inwards. And like looking inwards and agreeing that there's things that you have to change, there's things you do you don't like, can be really hard. And it's easier sometimes to just push that aside and point the finger at other people.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny how people, excuse me, one of the hardest things about taking responsibility, that's where I talk about the radical responsibility of getting out of that victimhood. When you take responsibility, not only can it be a sort of a shock to your system, but you'll find that people around you, they want to keep you in that victimhood. It's in their
Yeah.
best interest. And it's kind of funny how uncomfortable it makes people when you take responsibility. When I was having a consultation with my surgeon from a couple of years ago, who had operated on me and removed the tumors, and he was the very first one to declare me cancer free. And in a follow up visit post surgery, a couple weeks later, he's celebrating for me in his office that I'm cancer free. And somewhere I just sort of offhand said, well, I did this to myself. And what I meant by that was I was told at the age of 50 to get a colonoscopy, and it just was one of those things I didn't get around to doing. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like, look, needed to take responsibility because I never got around to the colonoscopy like I was told by my doctor to do. Fast forward a few years later, then I find out I've got stage 4 colon cancer. And he got very, I don't want to say upset, but he was uncomfortable. He said, hey, don't say that. You could have done everything right and still ended up with cancer. So quit saying that's on you. I said, no, doc. I said, that's just me taking responsibility for what I may have contributed to this. So it's one of the hardest things to get out of, is victimhood, because
Yeah.
you want to stay there because it's a comfortable place to be, but
Yeah.
also the world around you in many ways wants to keep you in victimhood.
Yeah, because it means they don't have to face their own victimhood. You're doing the same as them. It's almost like building like a rally and a team, a network of people that are on your side, and then you can almost, I guess, talk and complain about things together.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, the misery loves company, and yes, but also
Yes.
people in power gain a lot of their power by convincing others that they're victims,
Mm.
and it's the whole
Yeah.
rescuee kind of thing. And so there is a lot of self-interest, particularly in the form or on the part of people who are either in power or seeking power. And I'm not just talking about politicians. I'm talking about people in everyday life. If people can keep you in a victimhood status, then chances are you're still going to need them.
Yes. That's a very interesting point. I really like that. Okay. We have two final questions that I ask every guest to wrap up today. I know you've given lots of advice, but the first question is going to ask you for more advice. If you could go back and give yourself one sentence of advice at your lowest point, what would it be?
If I could go back to my lowest point, and I've had a lot of low points
Mm.
here in my life, so I've got a fair amount to draw on. Knowing what I know now, I would tell myself, and I'm trying to think of the right phraseology, to maintain optimism, because all of this difficulty, all I have to do is survive it, and it'll make you stronger.
Yeah,
So it may not feel like it, but you are becoming much stronger with everything you go through that's negative.
all about the learning in the process.
Very much so. Yeah.
And looking back on your journey now, is there anything you can smile or laugh about?
All of it. and
I
I,
get a
and
lot
I,
of guests that say that.
yeah, no. So, I write about this in my book, that healing humor, and I am one of these people that just I've got a I've always had kind of a sarcastic and dark sense of humor anyway, and so I can laugh at my own mortality, and I feel I've figured out that I have to temper that, because I have no sensitivity and I've got a sense of humor about it, but I realize that not everybody else around me does. So I have to check
Yeah.
myself a little bit, but I can laugh about things. And I think that's one thing that is one of the most therapeutic things when dealing with difficult circumstances in life is there is a lot to laugh about. And again, finding the humor is a skill. But what I can smile about are all of the amazing people. And I've said this to just my friends from college. I'm old enough now that it's been many decades since I was in college. Well, one of the beautiful things that happened as a result of my cancer diagnosis is we all reconnected, and we're
Wow.
a bunch of guys. We were very good friends back in college 40 some years ago. And we all went on after college and for the most part lost touch and moved on with our lives. And after my cancer diagnosis, we reconnected. And I've said it this way to them, and there are so many other people, not just my college buddies, but if my cancer journey, the hell that it was, and it was a walk through hell at times, if all that did is bring me back in touch with all of my friends from college, I would do this 100 times over again to have those reconnections. And so I just smile because at my point in life, now 60 years old, we're all in our 50s and 60s, all of us from there. That's just a beautiful thing to be able to reconnect with people that I was close with in my youth. So that brings a huge smile to my face every time I think of it.
Yeah, that's really special. Connection is so important, and it's the main thing that humans seek out. So,
Yes.
yeah, I'm really glad you connected back with them. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining. I really had a good chat.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Thanks for being so open with your story as well.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Of course. Hi everyone, I just wanted to say if you or anyone you know has a story to share, please reach out so that I can keep bringing you stories from our community. Let's get as many voices heard as possible. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, review, and follow. Thanks everyone!